Scott just released some pretty bad news about the FNAF movie. He just posted on Reddit a huge update on the FNAF movie. A very long little post here, going into a lot of the history of the movie, and he has some news about it at the end that might disappoint some of you. In fact, just the title of his post is some bad news about the movie. So let's see what we've got here. I'm going to be reading it out here to just see what we've got and keep you guys posted. So what did he say? Hey everyone, before we get to the bad news concerning the state of the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, I wanted to share a brief history of the FNAF screenplay. It's been a long road, so let's take a look at some of the best screenplays that have come and gone over the years, in no particular order. Or feel free to skip to the end really quick to see the bad news, and then come back to enjoy the list. Some of these came from big studios, some from big directors, some from me, and some from other hired writers. I gave the screenplays a name, and I'll include a brief synopsis, as well as what ultimately led to each screenplay being rejected. Let's get started. First is the F screenplay. The basic setup is a group of teenage troublemakers break into Freddy's and chaos ensues. Although a pretty basic setup, there were a lot of odd choices here, which only got weirder as the story continued. The story ended with our protagonists in a secret underground animatronic factory that was designing robots for the government. The verdict strayed way too far from source material and was tossed. Next is the Plushies Take Manhattan screenplay. The basic setup is the Plushies take Manhattan. The problems are that the Plushies take Manhattan. And the verdict? Burned with fire. Next is the Random Charlie screenplay. The basic setup is Charlie and her friends sneak into Freddy's after hours to retrieve a lost toy. Problems with this one include, although sharing names of familiar characters from the series, these characters had nothing to do with their game and book counterparts, so while featuring familiar elements of the games, it seemed too loosely based on the game, and lost a lot of its impact because of it. The verdict felt like a random bag of FNAF elements with no real stakes. Meh. Next is the Silver Eyes screenplay. The basic setup is, Kira and I worked on 3 versions of a Silver Eyes screenplay over the course of about a year, trying to find the right approach to the story from the first book. The problems are, these were the first attempts I made myself to write a screenplay after realizing it was going to be difficult to find someone else who understood the lore well enough to do it. Unfortunately, it also meant these screenplays suffered greatly from my inexperience at writing. Even Kira, with her writing expertise, couldn't save them. The verdict, although these had some good elements, I ultimately decided to focus on making a screenplay from the games, and not the books. The Pawn Shop screenplay. Basic setup, a kid who watches a pawn shop finds trouble when an animatronic is brought in. Turns out Freddy's had been robbed and the animatronics were taken to different locations for sale. The other animatronic come to retrieve the one at the pawn shop, and the kid and his friends get roped into adventure. The problems, while it's a creative approach, it felt a little bit too much like a boy and his animatronic. Too much after-school adventure, not enough horror. The verdict seemed like a good idea at the time. Next is the Cassidy screenplay. The basic setup, diving deep, this screenplay packed in a lot of lore, following the story of Cassidy. Problems, spanning multiple time periods, following multiple characters, and featuring lore from multiple games, this was pretty saturated to a fault. It may have been satisfying to the most hardcore fans, but it would have left the majority of people confused and lost. And, wait, maybe this was the most accurate screenplay. The verdict, ultimately more of a visual encyclopedia than a movie, this just wasn't satisfying, even to me. Out. The Misfit Kid screenplay. The basic setup, a single mom brings her kid to a new town, kid finds Freddy's, hilarity ensues. The problems, well, one of the problems is creating a modern-day story with an old Freddy setting is finding a way to connect the protagonists to the restaurant, finding a reason for them to be here, and finding a reason for them to stay. The problem here was that the reason for this kid to go to Freddy's and have misadventures was too contrived and too forced. The verdict, not a bad setup, but it just didn't work. If I don't care enough about the characters, then there's a good chance no one else will either. Pass. This was going to be the screenplay for a while because it didn't have any serious flaws. I ultimately decided it just wasn't good enough, though. Next is the Ghost Trackers screenplay. The basic setup, a group of amateur ghost trackers sneak into the abandoned Freddy's. The problems, although it's a very common sense setup for this sort of movie, the problem again arose about how these characters had a connection to Freddy's itself. What ended up happening was way too much of the story went to their own backstories and their own hardships, and it took the spotlight away from the story of Freddy's. The verdict, a stronger connection between protagonist and Freddy's was needed. Lesson learned. Next, the Insane screenplay. Basic setup, another Ghost Tracker variation, This one involved the Funtime animatronics, underground ball pit tunnels, and a marionette out for revenge. Problems: as some of the other screenplays ventured too far into adventure, this one fell too far into action. Verdict: too all over the place with too many characters doing too many things. Next is the Mike screenplay. Basic setup: this makes sense. Why didn't I think of this before? Problems? Actually, this is a good mix. It has the best pieces from all the previous screenplays. Not really any problems here. All the right characters, all the right motivations, all the right stakes. Yeah, we're going with this one. It's fun, it's scary, and it has a great central story. Oh, right, so on to the bad news. The bad news is that there won't be any more screenplays to add to this list, since we're officially making the Mike screenplay. Filming starts in spring. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Scott himself has clickbaited us. And I really only have one thing to say after this. I mean, his post pretty much covers all I would have to say. All I would like to say is...